A map of Europe at the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign in 1558 shows just how isolated England actually was. Although the Reformation throughout Europe had been widespread, there was no particular interaction between the three Protestant groups. The Lutherans of northeast Europe, who'd started it all off, the Calvinists in Switzerland, spreading to the Netherlands, with pockets building in France, and the Church of England of Henry VIII, Cranmer and Cromwell. And indeed there was rivalry between the new movements. The new Queen of England was firmly Protestant. In contrast to her half-sister Mary, Elizabeth had all the wit, charm and sharpness of intellect of her father, as well as the strength of character and determination of purpose. And she needed them. She was born here in the old Greenwich Palace, the same place as her father and her half-sister Mary. On the 7th of September 1533, her father had wanted a boy, and her mother had been beheaded in the Tower of London before Elizabeth had reached her 3rd birthday. Once Edward had been born to Jane Seymour a couple of years later, her father didn't want anything to do with her. But even then, after his death, when she was taken in by Catherine Parr, who had married again, Catherine Parr's husband would reportedly make a habit of playing with the young Elizabeth in her bedroom at night, in a way which the young teenage princess found difficult to cope with. Her father's will stated that she was 3rd in line to the throne, after her younger brother Edward and her older sister Mary. In addition to that education, when Mary came to the throne, Elizabeth was kept imprisoned in Hatfield House, and was constantly afraid of her sister consigning her to the Tower of London. As a Protestant, she was a constant threat to her half-sister Mary on the throne from 1554, and her life was always in danger of being brought to an end by the Papist Queen. There are a number of letters from Elizabeth to her half-sister, pleading for her life. Summing up the state of England at the time of her accession, on the death of Mary in 1558, this is what a contemporary commentator said. The Queen is poor, the realm exhausted, the nobility poor and decayed. There's a want of good captains and soldiers. The people are out of order. Justice is not executed. All things are expensive. There is excess in meat, drink, and apparel. There's division amongst ourselves. The French king is bestriding the realm, having one foot in Calais and the other in Scotland. There is steadfast enmity, but no steadfast friendship abroad. Calais, the last remaining possession of England on the continent, had been surrendered by Mary to the French earlier in the year. Generally speaking, nobody gave Elizabeth much chance of staying on the throne for very long. Add to that the fact that the ships of the English Navy were all rotten, sunk, or been sold off, and the Roman Catholic Church had vowed to reclaim England as a Catholic nation. In accordance with the diplomatic customs of the day, Philip II, the Catholic King of Spain, who had been married to Queen Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, offered his hand in marriage to Elizabeth herself, and that there was a ready-made Roman Catholic candidate, a descendant of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, keen to take the crown of England in the form of Mary, Queen of Scots, already married to the French king. And you have some idea of the problems at the start of her reign, which beset this young 25-year-old new Queen of England. But since the end of her teenage years, Elizabeth had been virtually under a sentence of death for being a Protestant, and her earlier upbringing had also been a preparation for getting out of tight corners. It stood her in very good stead. She appointed as her first minister William Cecil, who would be to her as Wolsey and Cromwell had been to her father. So now we've set the stage. And what better place to come to tell the Elizabethan part of the story than Stratford-on-Avon and Shakespeare's birthplace behind me. Philip II wasn't the only person to tilt his cap at the Queen. She would be a prize catch, and almost all of the crowned heads of Europe tried their hand, as well as a number of the nobles at the Queen's own court. She thoroughly enjoyed all the attention being paid to her, and accepted graciously all the gifts that were showered upon her. But Queen Elizabeth kept all her suitors guessing, interested but guessing, because if she decided in favour of one or the other, she would immediately make enemies of the ones she turned down. She played the game very skillfully for England's benefit. This is the entrance, but I'm not allowed to take the camera in, I'm afraid, so I can't show you inside. For some 10 years, the Queen bought time for England. And then, like us here, she had a stroke of luck. I can show you some of the inside, because I'm allowed to take still photographs. But the Queen needed to get some of her potential or actual enemies off her back. Mary of Guise, the mother of the French king, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, was assisting her teenage namesake to rule Scotland. And then the French king died. Mary was left on her own. And with some subtle assistance from her cousin Elizabeth, the Scots were able to dismiss the French soldiers from Scottish soil. Mary began to be courted by the nobility of Scotland. But Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't have the experience of Elizabeth necessary to face the challenges of emotion against intellect, the discipline of ruling the heart with the head. The absolute discipline that Elizabeth had learnt during her teenage years, which had enabled her to survive, was the difference between these two very attractive and very well educated young members of the blood royal of Europe. Mary's upbringing had been comfortable. She'd been the Queen of Scotland all her life since she was a baby, and had been treated as such. And her girlish instincts overcame the national interest of Scotland in a way which Elizabeth would never have allowed to happen to England. Mary married a wastrel, a member of the Scottish nobility, Lord Darnley, and together they gave Scotland an heir, James. Lord Darnley was then murdered by the Earl of Bothwell, and 2 months after the murder, Mary married the Earl of Bothwell. The people of Scotland were outraged. Turning a moment to continue our tour of Shakespeare country, this is the famous Anne Hathaway's cottage in Shottery, just outside Stratford. This cottage, originally a farmhouse, much smaller than it is now, was the home of the Hathaway family until 1892, and William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway got married in 1582, when Shakespeare was 18. He was born in 1564, which is 2 years after Elizabeth nearly died at Hampton Court from smallpox, which would have been very inconvenient for England, because if Queen Elizabeth had died without an heir of her own to continue the Protestant succession, the only heir would have been Mary, Queen of Scots, who would have brought England back under Rome's control. But this was when Mary, Queen of Scots, was busy alienating her own subjects north of the border. At the same time in Scotland, there was considerable religious upheaval because of the work of John Knox, who began his ministry as a chaplain in the court of Edward VI in England. Knox went on to study with Calvin in Switzerland and Germany, and it was John Knox's return to Scotland to convert the people from Roman Catholicism to the new Protestant religion, ousting the French, the use of the French language despite this stone being in Edinburgh, which was the luck that Elizabeth had, taking the pressure off her and England at a time when they were sorely pressed on every side. At least now the threat of a combined attack from north and south, a coordinated attack by the Scots and the French, had largely disappeared, helped enormously by her cousin Mary's disastrous choices in her personal life, which the Scots had now had enough of. Mary was forced to abdicate and into exile, and she threw herself on the mercies of her cousin south of the border and was promptly put under house arrest. Catholic plots against the Queen continued, but the Secret Service put in place by Henry VII and honed to perfection by Wolsey and Cromwell in the time of Henry VIII stood Elizabeth in good stead. Her objection was to religious extremism. Providing that her subjects were loyal to her, she wasn't concerned about their religious practice. But the papal bull of 1570, excommunicating Elizabeth, put an end to any thoughts of religious tolerance. The tenuous friendship between Philip II and Elizabeth of the early years of her reign was now at an end. England was on its own. All forms of Protestantism were targeted, particularly the growing rise of Calvinism in France. And when, on the 24th of August 1572, Catherine de' Medici and Mary Queen of Scots' mother-in-law Mary de Guise in Paris used a marriage celebration in the French nobility to massacre hundreds of French Huguenot Protestants, the ruthlessness of the Spanish Inquisition was printed indelibly on the minds of everyone in Europe. England and Spain seemed to be on a path towards war, with the imprisoned Mary Queen of Scots set to replace Elizabeth on the throne of England. The threats and plots against Elizabeth continued. There was a broadsheet published with all the details of them. For William Cecil, having Mary imprisoned in England was a mixed blessing. Her activities could be kept under observation, but her Catholic sympathisers and plotters were equally within reach for her too. But as the years went by, England and Elizabeth felt stronger and safer after they'd built up the resources to defend themselves against attacks on England's shores. The Queen devoted herself to matters at home, to deal with the unemployment. At Elizabeth's insistence, Parliament passed the Poor Laws, requiring justices to draw up lists of members of the local community wealthy enough to contribute to a fund to help out those who could not keep themselves and their families. More and more houses were being built of brick or stone, improving the general health of the community and avoiding the chaos of having to rebuild your house after it burnt down because it was made of wood. And instead of exporting the wool that the monasteries used to send to the Flemish weavers, people were now being taught how to spin the yarn and weave the clothes themselves in England, providing employment for those without a means of support. "I have desired," said the Queen to her Parliament, "to have the obedience of my subjects by love and not by compulsion." And that was how she got it. With the relationship with Spain now beyond repair, Elizabeth embarked on one last unsuccessful courtship in the form of the Duke of Alençon, who reminded her of a frog, and that's what she called him, her frog. And Englishmen have used the word as a term of affection for their French neighbours ever since. Our last visit in Stratford is to the house which now occupies the site where Shakespeare's house used to stand. The gardens are the same, but the house was knocked down by the man who subsequently owned it in the 17th century, because he was fed up with people knocking on the door and asking to look round the house where William Shakespeare had lived. He was a church minister, not a businessman. But returning to Elizabeth I, the problem of supporters of Mary Queen of Scots, plotting to put her on the throne, wasn't going away. Mary had designated Philip II of Spain as her successor. Philip was convinced that God was calling him to return England to the Catholic faith. An effective intelligence service was crucial. To protect the Queen, William Cecil appointed a new spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham. who persuaded one of the Roman Catholic supporters of Mary who used to visit her to take a barrel with a secret compartment where letters could be hidden. The letters were duly sent and received, but on the way they were read by Walsingham. For 7 months nothing incriminating was found, but then came a letter from Anthony Babington, revealing a new plot and asking for Mary's approval. Mary replied that she would prefer to see Elizabeth assassinated before her own release. Walsingham showed the letter to Queen Elizabeth. It was taken as complicity, and it sealed her fate. The trial was held at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire on the 1st of October 1586. There was only one possible verdict, but it took Queen Elizabeth a long time and much soul-searching before she eventually signed her cousin's death warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was finally executed on the 8th of February 1587, and immediately all of the English ports were closed to prevent the news being taken abroad. Walsingham already knew that Philip II of Spain was preparing an armada to bring troops from the Netherlands to invade England. For the next part of the story, we have to go to sea. So from Stratford-on-Avon, we'll move down to where Francis Drake made his name, Plymouth.